Good day, everyone. I am Jessa Tikisal, and this is my report on CA 200, which is Correctional Institution Module 1. What is correctional institution in the Philippines? So, the Philippine correction system is composed of the institution in the government, civil society, and a business sector involved in the confinement, correction, and restoration of person charged for and/or convicted of delicate acts or crime. So, the correctional institution composed of three dominant rules, which is which was the correction, rehabilitation, and treatment. So first, what is correction? Correction is where a person convicted is confined, or it is a jail where the person is taking care of the custody. Second, what is rehabilitation? Rehabilitation is a system used to provide a parole or a probation of a criminal offender. So, number next, treatment. What is a treatment? Treatment is a system that includes community-based services rather than disconnected from the community. It includes a medication, or it includes a medication of the criminal offender. It is a range of conceptual models including cognitive psychoeducational, therapeutic, or lie detector. It it's been used to identify and treat offenders. So treatment is a medication of a criminal offender. Okay. The public sector formulates sound policies and rules on corrections, penology and jail management, rehabilitation, and restoration. All prisons or penitentiaries, jails, and detention centers are under the direct control and supervision of the government. So it is the responsibility of the government. The government plays thus a dominant role in the correction and rehabilitation of the offenders. Next. So lesson 1. It discussed the global perspective on prison administration. Second, prison history from antiquity to modernity. Third, the Roman Catholic Church influence. And last, Pope John Paul II and Profile Pope, the Walnut Street Jail, King Henry VIII, and King Edward VI, a jail of King Henry VIII. Okay. So, introduction. In 2018, the Philippines held the sixth highest prison population out of 21 Asian countries. In 2019, the Philippines population rested at 108.31 million people, and 215,000 of those people were imprisoned or confined. So, in 2019, the the count of people who convict crime is increased. Therefore, the Philippines has an incarceration rate of about 200 per 100,000 citizens. There are 933 prisons running in the Philippines. Unfortunately, they are mismanaged and overcrowded. So, the prison in the Philippines is overcrowded, which is full of convicted criminals. Next. Global Prison Trends 2018, a global view on the state of prisons. Every year, Global Prison Trends by Penal Reform International in collaboration with the Thailand Institute of Justice. It provides us with a global view on the state of prisons. And every year, this report is unfortunately hardly a surprise. We read about the degrading conditions in which people are imprisoned and about their growing number. So, the level of crime in most societies is constantly decreasing. So, it is decreasing. The chapter on drugs and imprisonment in this report highlights that the high number of prisons in the world are overcrowded due to the incarceration of people for drug-related offenses, in particular nonviolent offenses involving use and possession of personal use. This directly reflects our contemporary addiction to punishment and showcases the disproportionality of punishment in relation to the offense. The use of harsh prison sentences for people who use drugs or for those who play a minor role in the drug trade also shows the inefficiency, limitations, and perverse effects of current drug control policies. Not only are punishment and incarceration becoming the sole instruments used to enforce the law, but also they are serving to implement moral norms which have no link with the reality of the offense that they are supposed to punish. So, we need to accept that behaviors and actions of others that are not aligned with our own moral perspectives do not need to be turned into criminal offenses. So, they are employ the moral norms in the government or in the society. So, supposed to not to not to supposed to punish the criminal behavior into a harsh way. These changes and reforms are being discussed and implemented in a global environment that remains highly stigmatizing, where drugs are still considered evil and prohibition approaches prevail. So, they are therefore born out of a real need, the need for societies to stop exposing their citizens to greater risks from arrest related to drug use than come from the act of using drugs. We need to introduce proportionate sentencing and alternatives to imprisonment for minor drug supply related offenses, and this will ease pressure on prison system. So the government introduced proportionate sentencing to decrease a prison system. So in 2016, the need for reforms was also highlighted at the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drugs. The special focus of Global Prison Trends 2020 is to identify the solution presented by increasing the use of alternatives to imprisonment and the challenges governments may face in implementing this. So, PRI, which stands for Penal Reform International, is to advocates for an increase in the use of alternatives to detention as a solution to the global prison crisis and in a long term to reduce reoffending rates, better protect human rights, and tackle overcrowding. Global Prison Trends 2020 explores the following subjects. So first, crime, justice, and imprisonment. Second, trends in the use of imprisonment, including the funding of penitentiary systems. Third, prison populations such as women, children, older persons, and minority groups. Fourth, prison management, including the provision of health services. Fifth, the role and use of technology in prison. And last, a special focus on alternative to imprisonment. Next, 5 facts about the Philippines incarceration system. So, these are the 5 facts. First, severe overcrowding. Second, pretrial detainees. Third, high death tolls. Fourth, vigilant justice. And last, the corruption. So, let me share to you what is severe overcrowding. Severe overcrowding is the search for efficient overcrowding solutions must be preceded by a search for causes of overcrowdings, which requires a definition of overcrowding. While the size of a prison system is mostly determined by the number of people admitted and the length of time they spend there. Remain there 20, the definition of overcrowding in the judgments of an overcrowding situation are based on a combination of normative and factual factors. International and regional human rights agreements. So this is their agreement, which prohibit harsh, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishment and ensure human dignity, give normative links to the definition of overcrowding. So, overcrowding is a harsh and this is a dangerous part of a prison and the experience of the prisoner. The definition of overcrowding and the determination of an overcrowding situation is based on a mix of normative and factual components. So, the prisons in the overcrowding is mixed. There are good, there are simply convicted when they are not committed, but there are others that committed the crime. So, the size of a prison system is a result of how many individuals are admitted to jail and how long they are stayed there. Overcrowding in prisons is a severe issue. Furthermore, despite the fact that national and international actors have been dealing with it for decades, the search for effective solutions to overcrowding must be preceded by a search of reason of overcrowding, which is dependent on a definition of overcrowding despite the fact that at its essence. International and regional human rights instruments that prohibit cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment give normative links to the definition of overcrowding, which are humiliating treatment, retaliation, assurance of human dignity. When Rodrigo Duterte won the presidential election in 2016, he promised to end crime within 6 months. This promise also included the killing of tens of thousands of criminals. Duterte's election led to the infamous war on drugs and eventually overcrowded prisons. So, when Rodrigo Duterte promised, but his his advocation is literally gone wrong because the Philippines are so much overcrowded prison. The prisons in the Philippines are suffering. Manila City Jail. This is the largest jail in the Philippines. Is split into dorms that safely house 170 inmates. Currently, these dorms house around 500 people. Similarly, a room designed for 30 people holds about 130 in the Quezon City Jail. This severe overcrowding in prisons led to illness and death tolls in the thousands. So, the primary cause of this overcrowding is to lead the prisoners into mental health or mental illness of a prison and can cause death. Overcrowding in prisons is a major contributor to poor imprisonment conditions around the world. It is also arguably the most serious problem confronting prison system, with effects that can be life-threatening at worst and hinder institutions from performing their functions. Despite prison overpopulation, a lack of information technology systems and knowledge, and insufficient training, The Philippine government continues to take significant initiatives to improve prison and jail facilities and offenders' treatment. However, the correctional system's reform and inmates' effective reintegration into mainstream life are not just the duty of the correctional system. It requires the support of participation of the entire community. In the punishment and rehabilitation of offenders, the government plays a dominating and vital role. Second, pre-trial detainees. Pre-trial detention is a legitimate interest of a state governed by the rule of law because it ensures an effective investigation of wrongdoing. This legitimate interest must be weighed against the negative consequences of pretrial imprisonment for the person involved. Pretrial custody, also known as confinement or preventative detention, occurs when a person is held by the government while waiting a trial to decide whether they are guilty or innocent of a crime. Third, I know, this is the second. The state of judicial proceedings the trial is known as pretrial. So this is the stage of judicial proceeding. Pretrial is important because it allows the parties to consider the prospect of mediation or submission to alternative conflict resolution methods. Pre-trial detainees in the Philippines in 2005 to 2018. So it is increasing. Pre-trial detention occurs for 71.1% of incarcerations in the Philippines. According to the World Prison Brief, pre-trial inmates accounted for 141,422 of the 188,278 prisoners in 2018. Unfortunately, many people are incarcerated despite not having been found guilty. Pretrial detention is used in many countries' legal system. So, the other many people of the incarcerated is not all having found guilty or not finished of the trial. People in countries like the Philippines may receive sentences that are excessively long in comparison to their offenses. In the Philippines, prisoners are held for an average of 9 months before being sentenced. Third, high death tolls. The Philippines has the world's highest jail occupancy rate, intensified by the Duterte's government's war on drugs, which has resulted in the imprisonment of hundreds of thousands of people since July 2016. Thousands of people have been arrested and detained for violating curfews and quarantine restrictions since March 21, since the COVID-19 occurs, adding to the already overcrowding police lockups and jails. As of November 2019, the combined population of individuals' jails in the Philippines Bureau of Correction Prisons and the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology's jail for those on trial or pre-trial was 215,000. So it is increasing. At the new Bilibid prisons, almost 5,200 people die each year. Overcrowding, unsanitary housing conditions, and inmate assaults, according to Ernesto Tamayo, the hospital's medical director. In 2019 Philippine Senate session, Tamayo stated that there were uncontrollable outbreaks of pulmonary tuberculosis. NBP also lacks nutritional foods and basic health care, in addition to overpopulation, substandard living condition, and inmate violence. According to Tamayo, every day at MBP or New Bilibid prison, at least one prisoner dies as a result of a miserable living circumstances. Thankfully, lawmakers and jail guards in the Philippines are working together to reduce prison overcrowding. Human rights activists have also requested the release of vulnerable prisoners to protect them from the harsh condition in which they are being held. As the death tolls grow, Philippine prisoners and drug treatment facilities become overcrowded as people try to avoid the same fate. So, this picture shows is the what are the prisons experience in the result of overcrowded. Vigilant justice is defined the activities of a single person or a group of people who claim to uphold the law but do not have the legal authority to do so. They are known as vigilant justice. However, the word can also refer to a general conditions of chaos or lawlessness in which multiple groups of people claim to be enforcing the law in a certain area. Vigilantism or vigilant justice appears to be the new specter stalking political institutions and civilizations around the world. We now have strongman presidents like President Rodrigo Duterte, shamelessly violating the rule of law in the name of public safety and social justice, rather than judges deciding who is guilty and who is not, or who goes to jail and who is released. During Duterte's presidency, the drug campaign intensified. Unemployed people were enlisted to eliminate anyone suspected of dealing, buying, or using drugs. Many homeless and underprivileged people joined the vigilant teams because it was one of the few methods for them to make money. If you know of any addicts, go ahead and kill them yourself. That was Duterte said in 2016. Duterte took office in 2016. The Philippines police force and identified gunmen have killed 7,000 known drugs traffickers and users. So that's what the President Rodrigo Duterte told the people to kill whether they find a drug users. So, the Philippines drug war has instilled the attitude that extrajudicial killing and violence are required to combat criminality. Human Rights Watch, on the other hand, has flipped the narrative on Duterte by disseminating facts on the Philippines' vigilant justice system. So, vigilant justice system is the endorsement of Duterte, President Duterte. Fifth, corruption. Corruption is most commonly defined as the use of public power for illegal purposes. Depending on how broadly public authority and private gain are construed, this term can be misleading broad. So, these are the examples of corruption in the Philippine criminal judicial system. First, abuse of public trust bribery. Second, profiteering immorality. Third, breach of faith, breach of trust. Fourth, complicity and graft-related activity. So, these are the problems in the Philippine criminal judicial system. Some of the prisoners are paid the government for them to release easily. So, they pay or they give a guarantee to the people who will help them to release immediately in the prison. Technically, It is an act committed with the goal of gaining an advantage at the expense of official duties and other people's rights. So they pay for the people's trust because as you can see there's a she or he has a lot of money to buy anything. These are the prohibited items in prison. First, cigarettes. Second, cell phones. And third, televisions. The public learned in August 2018 that the previous mayor may have been released from prison due to good behavior. So this is an example of a corruption. In 1993, he was arrested and accused with rape and homicide. Similar allegations of corruption in the Philippines jail persisted. Further charges arose as a result of this information. Prison employees and authorities were accepting payments to carry and distribute contraband to the convicts. So they receive money so that they will release easy. So as you can see in the picture, that is an example of a corruption in criminal judicial system. Inmates are allegedly allowed to hire personal cooks and nurses. Inmates who cannot afford a better life within the prison are confined to overcrowded and filthy cells, which they are more likely to become ill and die. So, if you, a prison, cannot afford a better life in the prison, you will go to the overcrowded who have been many prisons are there who cannot afford to hire personal cooks and nurses. So if you don't have a power, if you don't have a money, you will suffer. Officials are taking steps to eradicate corruption now that it has been exposed, one prison at a time. The incarceration system in the Philippines has to be reformed. Two of the difficulties that must be addressed are overcrowding and corruption, since overcrowding and corruption are the biggest problem in the society of a prison. The excessive use of pretrial detention as well as the use of incarceration for minor, petty offenses are major drivers of prison population rates in today's prison and jails. Overcrowding, as well as related issues such as lack of privacy, can exacerbate or create mental health issues, as well as increasing rates of aggression, self-harm, and suicide. There is optimism that as more people become aware of the Philippines prison system, circumstances will improve and vigilant justice would be dismissed. Fixing the Philippines' judicial and incarceration systems will take time. However, with the support of advocacy organizations such as Human Rights Watch, a change may be on the way sooner than expected. History of prisons from ancient to modern prison. From the birth of modern civilization in 3rd millennia BC, almost every major ancient civilization used concept of prisons as a mean to detain and remove personal freedoms of incarcerated people. Prisons were often used as a temporary stopgap before sentencing to death or life of slavery. But as time went on and our civilization developed, the earliest records of prison came from the first millennia BC. So, it is located on the areas of mighty ancient civilization of Mesopotamia and Egypt. So, as you can see in the picture, during those times, prisons were almost always stationed in the underground dungeons where guilty or suspected criminals spent their life either awaiting death sentence or command to become slaves, often working as galley slaves. So, in this picture, This is the earliest prisons in the millennium BC. Ancient Roman Empire continued to use harsher methods. Their prisons were built almost exclusively underground, with tight and claustrophobic passageways and cells, as you can see from the previous picture. Prisoners themselves were held either in simple cells or chained to the walls for life or for time. These are the earliest forms of imprisonment. The prison in ancient Athens was known as the Dysmoterion or place of chains. The Romans were among the first to use prisons as the form of punishment rather than simply for detention. A variety of existing structures were used to house prisoners, such as metal cages, basements of public buildings, and quarries. Crime and punishment. Some social scientists have suggested that global rates of crime are rapidly dropping due to less impoverishment. This raises questions of how closely crime is tied to poverty, as well as how to mitigate both together. Almost every major ancient civilization has employed the concept of prisons to confine and remove the personal liberties of detained people from the dawn of modern civilization in the 3rd millennium BC. Prisons were frequently used as a temporary stopgap before being sentenced to death or a life of slavery in the early periods of history. But as time passed and our civilization progressed, prisons began to evolve into correctional facilities that implemented the concept of prisoner rehabilitation and reform. Prisons were frequently used to house political prisoners, state opponents, and prisoners of war in addition to convict or suspected criminals. So in the picture shown, it is the imprisonment of an early 3rd millennium. So this is a prison in history. The earliest documentation of jails date from the 1st millennium BC, and they were found in the areas of Mesopotamia and Egypt's strong ancient civilization. Prisons were nearly always stationed in underground dungeons throughout ancient times, when guilty or suspected criminals spent their lives awaiting death or a mandate to become slaves. Greece. It is the birthplace of a modern democracy. So it is a Greece as shown picture below. Prisoners were housed in decrepit, isolated buildings where they were frequently visited by friends and family. Simple wooden blocks attached to their feet were the primary source of their confinement rather than dungeons, high walls, or bars. The ancient Roman Empire, on the other hand, proceeded to employ harsher tactics. Their jails are nearly entirely underground with squeezing corridors and cramped chambers. So, the history of prisons are located in the underground. Prisoners were imprisoned in basic cells or were chained to the walls for life as for a set of period of time. Slavery was the recognized norm at the time. The majority of individuals who were not sentenced to death were sold as slaves or utilized as labor by the Roman authorities. Slaves were used as gladiators throughout the Roman Empire, which was one of the most well-known uses for slaves. Many slaves were tasked as a support crew in addition to fighting in the arena, often after a lifetime of training in specific gladiator training houses or luduces, allowing the popular gladiator industry to run more smoothly. The enormous Colosseum Arena in Rome. So this is the enormous Colosseum Arena in Rome, home to the most famous gladiators' battleground. Had a slave army of 224 slaves who labored every day as power source for the complex network of 24 elevators and transferred gladiators and their wild animal opponents from the underground prisons to the arena floor. These are the conditions of the European prisons. The conditions in the European prisons remained harsh until English royalty started being more involved with their justice system. The history of correctional institution. In 2nd century BC, records found out many Egyptian and Mesopotamian archaeological sites proved the existence of the earliest prisons in the world. In 600 BC, the remains of the oldest known prison can be traced to the ancient room under Carcer Mamertino or Mamertine prison, originally designed as a cistern for water. This ancient prison was used for more than half millennia. One of its most famous prisoners was Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, executed at 46 BC. So in this picture, this is a Mamertine prison. In 200 AD, at the beginning of the new millennium, one of the oldest prisons outside Roman Empire was found in Israeli town of Tiberias. In 1166, Henry II commissioned the construction of first prison together with the first draft of English legal system that used concept of jury. In 1215, King John signed Magna Carta, which specified that no one may be imprisoned without a trial. One of the most historic pieces of jail registration was enacted. So King John signed that if no one person would be detained if without a trial. Prison timeline history. In 1400s, England establishes House of Correction, which housed growing numbers of homeless people. In 1600s, growing number of English prisoners gave birth to the military pardon. In 1700s, environment of Industrial Revolution and Napoleonic Wars brought great increase in the number of incarcerated people in England. For the first time, empty ships were used to house prisoners. In 1777, Englishman John Howard published influential book that proposed prison reform. In 1786 to 1791, over 50,000 prisoners was transported from the England to the North American continent and after the start of War of Independence to penal colony of Australia. So this is John Howard. In 1779, Penitentiary Act included the concept of the rehabilitation to the UK prisons. In 1791, philosopher Jeremy Bentham created designs for his perfect prison, where government could spy on unknowing inmates. In 1815, for the first time in history, UK government started paying the wage of jailers and expected condition in prison. In 1817, Elizabeth Fry fought for prison reform, solution of the problem of overcrowding, women's prison and children correction centers. In 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia started enforcing solitary confinement in an effort to rehabilitate its prisoners. In 1835, prison inspectors first started working in UK, together with first prison volunteer teachers. In 1877, Prison Act brought all prisons under the rule of the UK government. So this is Alcatraz Islands. In 1890, great amounts of insane, suicidal, and catatonic prisoners brought some concerns to the legal systems that enforce mandatory solitary confinement in U.S. prisons. In 1902, in this year, first reform school for delinquent boys is opened in Borstal, Kent. In 1934, American government opened Alcatraz prison for the nation's worst offenders. It is located in the Bay of San Francisco. This is a famous prison become part of the American history. So as you can see, the Alcatraz Island is a prison. So if you are planning to escape in the prison, you will die when you have no plan when you were escaping, because this prison is a heartless prison that you cannot escape, or that you cannot escape easily. One of the most common and dangerous health conditions within European jails is drug addiction, which is related only to mental illness. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, as the industry grew, English prisons became overcrowded, and new criminal procedures such as military pardons and penal transportations were employed. During the end of 18th century. Over 50,000 prisoners were transported from England to penal colonies in North America and Australia. Even until the middle of the 20th century, France employed penal colonies, most notably in French Guiana and the infamous jail Devil's Island, while Russia used isolated penal colonies in cold northeast Siberia. This is the modern period of prisons began with various jail reform in 19th century England, which led to the modern era of prisons that we know today. This is the age of enlightenment. The age the age of enlightenment in the 18th century had the greatest impact on jail reform. People began to appreciate reason and logic throughout this period, which is frequently referred to as the Age of Reason. With the Enlightenment, a new perspective on criminals emerged. During this time, inmates began to receive more care. The concept of rehabilitation was introduced, and governments all over the world, particularly in the United Kingdom and the United States, began to reconsider their views on solitary confinement, which was primary source of the increased numbers of insane, suicidal, and catatonic prisoners. The primary goal of these programs is to reduce recidivism, the number of inmates who reoffend after they are released from prison. The international wars that consumed the world at the turn of the 20th century resulted in the establishment of the vast number of war prison camps and concentration camps. The most well-known examples of these types of jails occurred during World War II, when the Nazi administration established over 300 detention camps in which political opponents, Jews, gypsies, criminals, and others were held without charge or trial. The majority of them were finally massacred on an unparalleled scale believed to be between 11 and 17 million people today. The contemporary prison system was completed around the end of the 20th century. In 1991, the concept of probation service was developed, and 3 years later, the first jail dedicated entirely to confining inmates in permanent isolation was established. Those supermax prisons grew in popularity across the United States with more than 40 in operation in 2005. Inmates in those jails are kept in cell isolation for 23 hours at a time, with occasional community yard time, labor, educational programs, and cafeteria meals. Over 9 million people are predicted to be in prison worldwide as of 2006, with the United States leading the way in terms of incarceration rates, which was 743 per 100,000 people. So next, we will tackle about the different types of prisons in antiquity times. There are various types of crimes and criminals. Some criminals are more dangerous than others, and some crimes are more serious. Other offenses call for greater penalties, and other criminals require more psychological treatment. This is why there are several types of jails. To better understand the country's criminal justice system, we need to clear up the difference between a jail and a prison first. So now we will tackle about jail versus prison. Many people are sure that jail and prison are exactly the same, so tend to use this term interchangeably. However, the next time you hear someone mean the same thing but say these two words, don't hesitate to correct them. In fact, jail versus prison true indeed very similar but have their differences. So the uses of jails is a confinement facility where people stay while they're waiting for trial or sentencing. A jail is run by local law enforcement and there's only one level of security. While the usage of prison is a facility for those people who have already received their sentence and the court has proved them to be criminals. Prisons are run by state or federal governments. Some prisons are run by private companies that make an agreement with the government. So these are the examples of how the jail and prison is different. In jail, 1 year or less of imprisonment in less severe crimes of local government. In prison, 1 year or more imprisonment, more severe crimes in state or federal government. Both a jail and a prison are correctional facilities that house persons who have been charged with or convicted of a crime. But that's where the similarities end. Function of imprisonment. The purpose of a sentence of imprisonment or similar measures deprivative of a person's liberty are primarily to protect society against crime and to reduce recidivism. So, social isolation and confinement means to isolate each of the offender. Repentance, punishment, and deterrence to punish the offender and to protect the offender and the reformation of the offender. Religion in corrections historical background. The influence and practice of religion in the correctional setting is as old as the history of prisons. Initial entry of religions into prison was probably carried out by religious men who themselves were in prison. The religion's role in prison. In jail, Religion's worth is frequently measured in terms of its contribution to an inmate's personal growth and development. The study focuses on inmates' perceptions of religion's influence in reducing recidivism. It emphasizes on the immediate importance that faiths have for inmates by assisting them in coping and surviving. Religions of influence and practice in correctional facilities is as old as an institution in itself. Religion was most likely first introduced into jail by religious individuals who were also incarcerated. In the Old Testament, such prisoners include Joseph and Jeremiah, and in the New Testament, John the Baptist, Peter, John, and Paul. The early Christian church, beginning with Constantine, referred shelter to criminals who would otherwise have been mutilated or killed. Although most countries banned it by the 15th century, the practice of releasing criminals over Easter and requesting pardons or reduced sentences from church officials persisted for centuries, with the latter remaining in use in a modified form. The use of religion prisons as a replacement for corporal or lethal punishment became popular. The Roman Catholic Church established correctional tactics, whether later adopted by secular states, such as the monastic cell, which served as a site of punishment for criminals. The Protestant of Amsterdam erected a women's correctional facility in 1593 and the men's one in 1603. In 1703, in Rome, the Sisters of the Good Shepherd created women's correctional facilities, while Pope Clement XI built the famed Michael Prison as home of correction for younger criminals, emphasizing separation, solitude, labor, and prayer. This is the Vatican Jail. The Vatican Jail functioned as a model prison architecture for Europe and America as late as the 18th century. The censure, the stocks, and the wiping post were among the customs and commandos introduced to North America by early settlers. Isolating offenders from other inmates became standard jail practice in the 18th century. Long-term seclusion, paired with in-depth sessions with clergy, was considered to lead to inmates repenting or becoming penitent from their misdeeds. As a result, the word penitentiary was coined. Many of the jail changes were supported by Quakers from West Jersey and Pennsylvania. They came up with the notion of replacing corporal punishment with jail and integrating the prisons of workhouse concepts. The Walnut Street jails in Philadelphia served as the model for this regime. As its design bearer, the Quakers' faith in man's ability to overcome adversity through repentance and introspection one can be for. Even after the Auburn system introduced daytime employment in the 19th century, solitary confinement at night remained the norm in penal practice. The previous penitentiary forced solitary incarceration was considered to fulfill the same repenting goal. The belief in education as a strategy for curbing criminal conduct aided the spread of religion in jail. Due to the limited resources of correctional institutions, Chaplains were regularly called upon to serve as the lone instructor in many American jails. So, sometimes the schooling involved the priest standing in a dark corridor with a lantern suspended from the cell bars, praising the virtues of repentance. So, volunteers have also had a long history in corrections, dating back to the establishment of jails. Maud Bollington Booth, the daughter-in-law of William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, was well known as champion for volunteers in jail. So this picture showed this is Maud Bollington Booth and William Booth. Many volunteers are critical to religious activities today, and without them, inmate participation would be severely limited. Faith representatives would be unable to minister to them due to the large quantity and variety of detainees. Next, many order correctional institutions are being renovated or retired, and their spaces are being replaced with structures that provide better surveillance and security. So, it is replaced with the strong surveillance security. There. However, religion's initial influence on the concept and construction of the institution will certainly be remembered in correctional history. So, it is still a memorable correctional history. The reasons for inmates' religious involvement. So, correctional inmates may also become involved with religion to gain protection, meet other inmates, meet volunteers, or obtain special prison resources. Second is the physical protection. To be safe, many inmates believe that they need to be part of a group which can provide physical protection from other inmates. So, that's all of my report. Thank you for watching and God bless.